Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Okay, so today we are talking about various personality tests, Myers-Briggs, Enneagram. There's a whole bunch of these. What color is your parachute? StrengthsFinders. All these ways of classifying dimensions of ourselves as I try to generalize. And the reason we're doing this is that we, as we've mentioned on this, on these talks, Nick and I meet regularly at a coffee shop in Princeton called Small World. If you're ever there on Saturday mornings, you'll probably see us. There's a big table there. We're usually there, and I'm usually laughing at something Nick has just said. Anyway, we were laying out the next couple of talks, and we as we did last week, we did the PAW formula: performance equals ability equals self-worth, and that how we tend to restrict ourselves to that way of interpreting performance, ability, and self-worth, or self-worth by our ability and performance. And then that naturally got into a discussion about all these tests. So we were like, well, let's go and talk about it. So if you haven't watched our video on our discussion about the PAW formula, I really encourage you to take a look at that. We'll put that link to the video in the description below. But anyway, maybe Nick, if you could start us off, maybe very quickly give us a summary, a quick summary of the PAW formula, how you derived that, and how it is relevant to what our discussion today.
Great. Yeah. So quick reminder. So PAW, the letters P-A-W stands for performance. We often put an equivalent sign or equal sign that is equivalent to my ability, which is equivalent to my worth. So empirically, we know that many people carry around this set of interlocking, mutually supporting beliefs about our performances. We explain our performance, our achievements in some domain, whether it be athletics or academics, in terms of our abilities. And that many of us conceptualize our abilities as largely relatively fixed, essential, pretty innate, certainly enduring. And then we also equate our sense of worth, our worthiness, or deservedness, whether we're good, in relation to both the performance and our sense of our abilities or capabilities. And this has then, in achievement context and some others, there's some counterintuitive dynamics that follow from that. So a couple of big ideas is to communicate is that we have these, human beings are organized to have these broad, enduring mental formations. We can call them beliefs. They're broadly applicable. They last for a long time. We often acquire them through socialization or conditioning and culture. We don't even realize that we fully have them. But they're operating all the time about how the world is. And so one of these, like, okay, you drop something, it's going to fall. There's a kind of causality, or whether you call it gravity or not. But there's also these human beliefs, and there's beliefs about ourselves. So what psychologists and others have ascertained is that your beliefs about your self-beliefs are really powerful. And so Kierkegaard and Dr. Frawley here have also concluded, hey, you're carrying around these beliefs about yourself. You are in every situation that is a situation to you. Hence, or therefore, your beliefs about yourself are going to influence a lot. They're both a lens on the world. They're a tool or a framework with which to interpret what happens to you. You project these beliefs out. You also put or impute these beliefs about yourself into other people's minds, and then act as if they believe that about you. And so you can see the complexity and power and ubiquitousness of these self-beliefs. They're operating all the time. And I go a little bit further to say that these beliefs are the raw material, are the basis for other self-processes like interpretations or self-judgment, self-appraisal. So this idea of a self-relationality is constructed or made through these processes. I see a look across someone's face, and then I interpret that, and then what does that say about me? And that connects. So they always do that because I'm this, and we have this elaborate mechanism mentally and emotionally to create these interpretations. And so, number one, again, that the point is that these beliefs are powerful. 2, they are widespread. They're commonly held. What I haven't said so far is they're also mistaken. So people have mistaken beliefs about ability, just in general. So if you've heard of Carol Dweck and her work on fixed mindset, the premise there is that our brains and minds and capabilities are much more malleable than the vast majority of people have come to believe, and that has many consequences. So that's one big idea. And then I think what your approach, Matt, and our approach on self-worth theory adds another one, is that we use these to make judgments, appraisals of ourselves and others, by the way. And so they're powerful, but often tacit. We don't even realize it. And so these beliefs are often inaccurate. They're just not true empirically. Yet we know empirically that people hold this framework quite commonly. So I think if that kind of lays out the big ideas, the backdrop, and then we can say, I think what we want to do today is kind of explore, if people are carrying around this set of beliefs and we use them in this way, how do self-assessments or other instruments or tests, categorization systems then play into that? Or how might they have unintended negative effects? Or how might we interpret certain outcomes in ways that are unhelpful? Like imposter syndrome, I think, is really usually unpacked with this set of beliefs.
Right.
Be one example.
Yeah, I think where we're going to land is to say that these are tools that can be helpful, but we have to see them as such, and as a diagnostic tools, let's say, versus something, well, I'm this. Like we get into this fixed mindset and say, well, I'm this, this, and this, and so thus I need to be this way, or this situation doesn't go my way. Well, it can reinforce ways that we interpret and react that are unhelpful.
That's right.
And unhealthy. So that's where we're going to land, I think. So anyway, but
yeah,
let's
start with that. I think.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
We think that human beings are more malleable and have an impulse to grow and change and develop, and that's fundamental to the organism. That's who we are as human beings, and that's in tension with understanding ourselves in essentialized, fixed ways.
Right.
Right. So it's not that there's not differences among people and there isn't such a thing as abilities, but where do they come from? What is the potential for growth? How might they change and develop? And I think sometimes we don't consider that. And so if you, like you and I, we start with that sense of the potential, then we can see sometimes maybe the allure and appeal of a categorization system or classification system, but we could also notice, like you're saying, the unintended consequences of, in particular, the application or implementation of that in practice, in real life. Right.
Yeah, I think where I've seen that, because I run in Christian circles, is right now what's very popular is something called Enneagram, which how it became so popular in Christian circles, I'm not quite sure. It's stated that it comes from very old spiritual beginnings, but it was made popular, I think, in the mid 20th century. And anyway, there's there's 9 Enneagrams, 9 categories, and you are basically put in one of those. Now it gets very elaborate, because you can be like a 8-wing, this, that. I mean, it's the complexity is pretty incredible. In common parlance, though, like in the way it's talked about, it is very fixed. Like, you'll hear people say, "Oh, he's a 3. Oh, she's a 5." And I'm sitting there like, what are you talking about? And then you like, well, what am I? And then it's easy. A lot of people say, well, I'm a 5, let's say, and I think 5 is I can't even remember. It's more intuitive. Bookish kind of ideas. Anyway, it's sometimes used to say, well, that's how God has wired me, and so thus I need to be pursuing or be this type of way of being, be it at work or whatever. And the way people react, like, oh, this person react this way because they're an 8. And then, 8s, I think, tend to, the negative side, they tend to be a bit bullish, a bully, bullying, a little aggressive in their opinions. And I'm sitting there like, well, you might have that tendency, but it doesn't mean that you have to react that way. Or, if you believe in God's calling, that God's calling you to do this or this because of your dispositions and whatnot. So it becomes very fixed right away. I think that's a misuse of it. And yeah, and I think, at least in the Christian history, there's like plenty of people who were maybe had these certain Enneagrams. And again, you might have these tendencies, but, to say that you have to be doing this type of, work or career versus that, I think is really confining to yourself and to, God's promptings and whatnot. So anyway, that's how I've experienced it recently.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the, my mentor, Marty, come to him, we had some talks about this. He said that's a description that's used as an explanation. Right. And those are very different things.
Yeah.
And we can unpack, if it's, we can unpack in very specific ways, not the Enneagram in particular, but any kind of instrument like this, and to have some caveats and qualifications. And I think there's we can understand why it's appealing and how it could be useful and what its limitations are. And I'm not a psychometrician, but I've taken a class and I know some things and I know about these instruments, and I'll try not to use some technical language, but I'm pretty skeptical. I'm just going to say that up front, of the application in reality, because the instruments, here's what they almost never do, is say, I'm going to say up front, what percentage of your behavior I'm going to explain with this framework, or how much of it. But they're not saying this explains everything. Well, how much? So there's a common way to measure empirically interventions in the human sciences education to say, okay, this factor explains that percentage of your performance. So if you do the homework in Intro to Chem in a particular way on a regular basis, and you turn it all in and you get perform, then that can, and those who do that and versus those who don't, that tells us we can quantify what the impact is, right, in percentage terms. 48%, whatever. That's actually is, I think, was the percentage of a study I read recently. Okay. Well, what are these other things explaining? Because they're not claiming it's everything, but how much is it? And is it the more important factor? So in my case at the university, just to give a couple examples. So students, I'm all for the development of self-knowledge. I'm all for, and I love the impulse of inquiry and trying to understand oneself and notice patterns, can contextualize with, oh, that changes. Plus, I'm in an environment. A lot of these things are comparative. I'm deciding I'm good at something by comparing myself to other people in the environment I've been in. So is it more important to know you're an 8 with us, not to be dismissive, a side of 9, right? Or is it more important to understand the context and situations that you're in? Or how do these things intersect? So sometimes my concern is simply that it simplifies our understanding of the world and the context situations we're in. It can be very reductive in our understanding of ourselves. And I'm very concerned that then when other people, they've internalized it and they found it valuable, now they're projecting onto somebody else. They're saying, you're a 3, you're a 3. How is that different than saying, you're not capable? You're not smart. The thing that's challenging about this language isn't that people say you're not smart when they made a mistake. It's not that they didn't make a mistake. It's what's the explanation? Is it absolute? Is it essentializing? And so that's what still remains shared by the application of many of these things, these tools. And then one thing I see, and by the way, I don't know if you even know this, Matt. I used to, for 2 years or a bit more, I worked for the Johnson O'Connor Research Foundation. I don't know if they still exist, but this is one of the best in aptitude testing and career and educational development consulting kind of businesses, which sounds very deterministic. Aptitude, that's who you are. But one of the things that I saw the most was, and you see it with learning styles, people say, well, I told the instrument this, and then the instrument told me back what I told it. Boy, it's appealing, right?
Right.
It's very circular. And then because I'm visual, I am not auditory. So this fallacy is all over the place. These are mutually exclusive categories, and the obverse cannot be true. There's no inherent reason that's the case. That is not even built into the system. Even if it were even if you agreed with learning styles or some of these other things, they're not in opposition necessarily. You can have attentional issues where you're distracted and be super focused. Look around. I see people doing that.
Right.
At the most basic level. So this is an example I would consider in the implementation or the fidelity of application of the tool. And so I don't know the empirical foundations for the Enneagram, and if it's been assessed or what have you, whether that's reliable or valid in its measures, but even things that are scientifically derived, just because some concept, some phenomena has been found robust through lots of robust studies, doesn't mean you're applying it correctly. I saw that all the time. People learned about confirmation bias. Then they're using this to all over the place. I'm like, that's not a confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is scientific. Yeah, but you're not active. You applying it is not science. That's not science. Science is how the concept was created. That doesn't mean you're using it correctly. Does that make sense? So, and that's with a robust finding, right?
Right.
That's my diatribe more than useful comment. Sorry.
No.
I think I crossed over the edge.
No, that's actually great because, well, I think, again, what we're saying is it's not that these typologies, these categorizations are wrong per se. I mean, I know Enneagrams. I think one of the big criticisms is there's not a lot of psychological research backing it up. So that's warranted. But they can be tools if used properly. That's, I think, what we're, if, like the old thing of like you have a hammer and you just go around hammer everything. That's not a proper use of a hammer. So, is it not everything's a nail, I guess what we're saying. And so how do you use these personality tests, strength finders, whatever, in a constructive way? And a lot, because they do provide a lens that can be helpful for introspection and, why do I have a tendency to do this? It's saying, well, like to just essentialize, as you say, is almost to cut off the internal conversation you could have with yourself and just say, well, I'm this. And thus you begin to interpret everything in that way versus, well, the more deeper reflection would say, well, why do I have a tendency to do this? When do I have a tendency to do this, as you just said? So that's, I think, what we're trying to get at is the deeper, rich conversation you should be having with yourself and perhaps with a counselor or a good friend or whoever who can help you in that journey. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And it's not a critique of the individual human being saying you blew it, you didn't use it right. It's actually that it's really hard to translate these instruments into the I don't know why this phrase came to mind, the hurly-burly, of lived experience, right? It's just complicated. There's a lot of things going on, and you have this vantage point, and we have these impulses and motivations that we're even not aware of to think in particular ways. So that's why I use this word appeal. These, beliefs are powerful, and then some authoritative external source telling you something very appealing, until it's not, then you might dismiss it, but it can be very appealing. And that's part of the problem. And then I think, again, the nature of human beliefs is we tend to grab these ideas and then we use them over and over and over again. And in that process, we often can solidify or reify these beliefs. So they gain power. Then they seem to be more explanatory. So I think the phrase I often use is kind of holding these things lightly.
Right.
Holding them lightly. So let me just give it, let me give an example. So you could say, and maybe there's a critical listener of our podcast saying, but isn't PAW a categorization system and you're classifying people? And isn't this your model? Isn't this exactly what you're critiquing? It's a little different, but I think that's a legitimate point. What I might say, if you were to really push me, and this came out in a conversation the other day with my training the academic coaches that I work with, I commit to the framework of self-worth theory. If you said, am I absolutely certain? Do I acknowledge that you could understand much of the same phenomenon by thinking not that worth is the main impetus or impulse, but meaning, which is somewhat different, or power or affinity? I would say, yeah. There's a cluster of these beliefs that are very powerful and it's hard to distinguish. And in fact, to some extent, I don't think it's all that important to say one is the most important. That was kind of a funny sentence. I don't think it's important to say that was most important, but rather to say these frameworks can bring order to your understanding of the world and experience. Yet, and what I would say about procrastination, like there's common patterns of procrastination. I can make generalizations. I can give you a framework that helps you explain yourself. And you're like, wow, how do you know that about me? Yet at the same time, we also do it individually and idiosyncratically. So I think it's just this point that's the relationship between what any kind of framework of classification or typology can do and its application in the real world. But I would also say that there's some that are particularly appealing or have challenges. And I think those things are about ourselves and internal processes where we have this subjective experience that's accessible essentially to no one other than ourselves, if even to ourselves. So even experts. So again, I said, hey, I'm not saying people are dumb and they can't use these tools. I'm not criticizing people. Even like the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, if used in psychotherapy, there's lots of studies that show that so you have these criteria, these explanations, and then the actual trained therapists applying those and then coming up with a diagnosis and label, there's actually not a lot of reliability there. These are experts. These are people in training, right? So who have very well established criteria. It's just a hard thing to do. So that's why I kind of go back to holding lightly these insights. Then I think there's this question of just change.
Right.
How much do we believe human beings can change?
Yeah. So just for kind of moving forward in the discussion, I mean, one thing I thought we were talking about was my own, as you know, I went through a year of pretty intense counseling. And at one point, the counselor was actually, no, there were two involved, but one was gave me a book to read. And it was a Jungian book. I can't, because I think there's like 12 archetypes, but this one had 4, and then it's like the ideal, and then the negative. I can't remember it. It sounds very Enneagram at this point, but anyway, because the reason he had me read it was because a lot of my humor used to be very cutting, like, and he said, well, let's explore that. I don't even know how it came up, and it was interesting because there's this, like, in this book they used kind of a Jungian approach, and they had this one archetype called the Joker, and it was really illuminating for me because I was like, wow, that really did describe who I was. Now, it wasn't, what was nice though, it was, with counseling, you're on a journey. And so he wasn't saying, well, that's you, and that's you for life, and that's just explains everything. It was more like, okay, this is a way to kind of help you get your hands around this proclivity you have towards really cutting other people down through humor. So, but let's explore why that. So it led to the deeper conversation, and it wasn't. And again, it wasn't. But it just, in a way, as a doctor, he had the right diagnostic tool to kind of help probe where there was pain and that to myself and what I was causing to others. And so in that sense, it was really helpful because it helped give me language to explore more deeply what was going on internally. And thus, that was manifesting itself in this humor. So it wasn't like that in itself was the issue, as a manifestation of a deeper issue that I had to explore. And so that's what's, in a way, so can be so helpful about these. But we're kind of, we want to talk about how we misuse these, or we latch onto these, and what's so appealing about them. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, so yes, these can be really helpful, but we tend to misuse them often in a way to stereotype ourselves. And so why is that? Why is it so appealing to us? And appealing in a way to that, that's not helpful.
I think I think some of the research on on beliefs and P equals A equals W, and even testing, American society really is. BuzzFeed exists because we have these tests. I think that's a cultural proclivity. It's a cultural bias that's particular, I think, to Americans, maybe North Americans. I don't know a lot, but and then we attribute that, and we're not very critical, it seems. So I think that societal level, we've internalized that this testing, and we sort people, and there's some histories about that. But I think the positive impulse is people want to understand themselves. There's a starting point that there is some underlying dynamics that are common to my experience, and that's probably that makes sense to me. There's also the reverse of that, which is Americans tend not to attribute much to the situation or context. We have these ideas about ourselves, but not just Americans. So I think that's really broad. I think there's maybe some things that are ascendancy in our culture right now. So if we take P equals A equals W, the self-worth theory, and think about procrastination and why people do that, even when it's not in their interest, we can use some of these principles perhaps to explain. So one of the things that procrastination does as a protective response to an environment or situation is a strategy for self-protection, for protecting our sense of self, especially our sense of our capability, in context where our performance is going to be evaluated, and then there's going to be kind of attribution to our ability and maybe even our worth. Am I worthy of being in the Ivy League? How do I understand that? And so some counterintuitive responses are actually you might sacrifice your performance through procrastination, or procrastination in a certain way, or put in jeopardy your performance by reducing your effort, by creating conditions. You have a ready explanation of your performance, not in terms of your ability, which you're trying to protect, and therefore which protects your judgments on your worth. Well, can these labels or assessments or categorizations serve a similar purpose? Are they protective by exculpating us, by removing our responsibility for our performance and attributing it elsewhere? Right. So is my performance? Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to stop you there because I think that's a really key point. How does it almost seems contradictory, like in a way, you could say, oh, I messed up. Like I didn't do well here, or I didn't handle the situation well. And instead of, it's like, well, I'm a X, Y, and Z. And then it becomes externalized or something. It's like somehow the blame or whatever's pushed away. So it's when these are meant to help self-reflection, it's almost becomes a tool to distance yourself and not lead to self-reflection. Is that correct?
I think it can. And I think the people who create these instruments and use them and apply them professionally would say they see it too, and that's not the appropriate use. And, you know, to use your example, to use it appropriately would probably require some dialogue and discussion with an expert in multiple sessions and really some hard work and internalization. And so if you use this thing and then you're using it in this way, we might take it a little bit further and say, yeah, and what's motivating that misuse of this? It's not just it is hard to do. That was my first point, right? It's hard. The fidelity of the application can be quite challenging. That doesn't mean there's not other motivations, right? I think that's what we're getting at here. Meaning, so more.
Yeah. So I love the self-protection. Like it's, and this is a really interesting point because, in a way, we're always about ourselves. Like we talk about, like the self-relationality, but in a way, often we don't want to involve ourselves or really look at ourselves because there could, because you don't want a judgment on yourself that you're less than what you thought you were, or there might be some pain or sense of nothingness that's lurking deep down there. Like you don't want to deal with that. So if any way I can project problems or whatever outside of myself, or just somehow distance myself and not have to deal with myself, that is a self-protective measure. That procrastination is a key example of that.
Yeah. So in certain environments, right, I think all the time we want to not feel inadequate. And I think if just pause in that word inadequacy, like, can you imagine a scenario where you want that word applied to you? Probably not. It's pretty painful to me. It's certainly painful, but maybe that's reflective of me. But I think, right, inadequacy. Ooh, yeah. So from a self-worth perspective, there's different kinds of reactions to the poor performances or the interpretations to them. And there's a distinction made, for instance, between guilt and shame. Shame being the more powerful, corrosive emotion. And shame is one interpretation. Is shame differs from guilt in that it's inherent in you, something in you. Less guilt, something you do. And shame, from a self-worth perspective in particular, is something your capacity, what you are able to do. And so it's shameful to not be able to do something. You might feel guilty if you didn't do it, but you could. But it's better in our many contexts, quote, in a sort of hierarchical relationship, is better or more tolerable. Let's put it this way. It's more tolerable to feel guilty than it is to feel ashamed due to inadequacy. And so we create these. Go ahead.
I just want to like drive home that point, is that guilt, you still have the capacity to do something and you just didn't do it. So you feel guilty, like I should have done this. Shame is saying, well, I didn't even have that capacity. So that's why it is more corrosive and more self-defeating and harder to live with.
Particularly if you hold the quality of beliefs that your capacities are largely fixed and innate and essential and changing, right? If you don't have that, then that's not so painful. But if you hold that, if you understand ability in that way, then, right, so it's not separate from the belief. That's why we start from the beliefs. It's the way you conceptualize and internalize your understanding of this thing we'll call ability or capacity. And then also why you didn't do something in practice, there's more ambiguity. Well, the situation prevented me from doing that, even though I created the situation that led me to be inadequate time to put in to the work or what have you. Yeah, and just to be clear, if the tone is judgmental toward people, I've done this a million times. The point isn't that this is some moral failing. The point is that this is a human dynamic, and that if you want to be aware of that for yourself, and then gain insight through this framework and make changes. But so the point here was that there are certain kinds of beliefs and interpretations that can be more painful, debilitating, and we're averse to that. We're going to avoid that in various ways. And so the given those proclivities of human beings, these assessment systems, these self-assessment systems, these labels, these categories can actually then be appropriated, if you will, into these dynamics and used in unhelpful ways, particularly if at some level we're seeking to protect ourselves. If we're seeking insight and awareness and growth and development, and that's really motivating us, then we probably won't have a ready, simplistic interpretation of some sort of test or finding. At the same time, not everybody has the time or wherewithal to then say, oh, I have this measurement, let me go figure out what it means, right? Like you can do a blood test and get the results I have and then go, what does this mean? We don't assume we know what that means. We go talk to an expert, and then that expert may say, I don't know what that means. You need to go talk to another expert. But we get our tests off of the internet and we go, yeah, I know what this means. Like, no, you don't actually.
So can we just give some examples of ways you've seen people, even ourselves, use these tests inappropriately for self-protection? So I mean, we talked about how, people think of the modalities for learning, be visual, auditory, kinetic. And I mean, I guess, just think off the top of my head here, like you could be like assume that you're a visual learner, and you might have that tendency. Like I tend to, I think I'm more of a visual learner. Like you show me a graph, I'm like, boom, I got it. Where if I'm listening to a lecture, I tend to, not process as quickly. And that's a tendency, so, and we're saying, it's not so like, it'd be easy for me to say, well, that professor just talked, there were no visuals, and it really, given I'm a visual learner, no wonder I got a B-. But that's a crude, quick example, but that's a fixed mindset right there, right?
Yeah.
That just, and again, instead of saying, well, what could I have done to, differently, how could I have studied, how could I have adapted to, all these ways I could have grown and problem solved in that class. Instead, I just said, well, I'm this, he or she did that, so they're really to blame. What could I have done?
Right. So you're highlighting that the essential, especially the reductive, essentializing, simplistic way we use this, and then there are common human fallacies, or unexamined questions. So I have this, but I just back up. It's not that I don't think people don't have variety in terms of their capacities or proclivities or preferences or abilities. What I question is, where does it come from? And how do you know? The test can't tell you that. The test can't say why you have a visual preference and you're quite good at it. Are you born with it? Maybe. Again, I'm not saying there's not variety, but you don't know. We don't know. The test cannot tell you that. So why do people think that? That's the belief that we're imputing. We're inferring that. Why? Because in our society, we at this time and we believe that is a widely held belief. We love the natural. We love the prodigy. Look around in the media. There's someone who has some magical ability. It's inherent. Harry Potter. We want to be Harry Potter, not Hermione Granger. Hermione is just as good as a wizard, but she worked at it and studied. No, we want to be special like Harry and have it born and given to us, and we're great in our society. Most people. The point is, and then these interpretations, the uses. You could say, "Wow, I'm really good visually. I've learned how, or I've got the strength. I just can do it." Whatever. So I'm going to focus on developing my auditory capacities. I almost never hear that. That's just as logical, right?
That's a good point.
Because guess what? The world has sounds, and I'm going to be in it.
Right.
So why? So when I coach people, I say, okay, you're trying to learn something, some content, and you want to build your capacities. It's a general rule of thumb is start with your strength. So if you're really good visually, do that, and then practice auditorily to build that capacity. We don't know what your capacity is. We can't build it, or at the very least, and then it's not even a capacity. It's what are skills, irrespective of your capacity, that I can engage in and use to maximize my performance in that area. But these are not widely used, and when you say it, it's like obvious, but it's almost never discussed. That's a sign that our beliefs and assumptions that we're bringing to the interpretation of the results are determining that. But those beliefs are not proven by the instrument. They're not suggested by the instrument, the assessment instrument. If you really push the people who make them, they would say, yeah, that's a perfectly good use of it. We just don't in a practical matter in our society.
And is it solely this idea of like, as you said, like we want these special powers, we're this, and what is there any other dynamics going on, or have you thought about that?
Well, I think it's these simplistic, I mean, I think there are human beings, there's some power to essentializing, to creating these beliefs. There's power in the confirmation bias. There's a bunch of biases that human minds engage in. And then I'm not an expert in that, but I could probably explain some of these dynamics in terms of that. So we want simplicity. Simplicity as a framework is super powerful, right? So Newton said, hey, you can explain all of the physical mechanics of the universe in 3 laws. Whoa, that's super powerful if you can understand those 3 laws and then crucially be able to apply them in real life. Super hard. Ask any physics student. So I think that just rationally there is utility or usefulness in creating a simple framework, and there's a tendency or over reliance that's maybe as human beings, and then there's certain beliefs, right, in the cultural context. What John Searle, the philosopher of mind, called the ground. We're born into a world that has beliefs and ideologies and thoughts and assumptions that are just moving around in our society, where it's the air, it's the water we live in. And I think those matter too, right? So if you lived in a different society, we probably would hold on to this a little bit different, and you see that. So it's not uncommon in the United States, we'll say I'm a math person. And the way you get good at math is by being born a math person.
Right.
If you ask, my understanding is, if you ask people in China, you say, how do you get good at math? And they're like, well, you do a lot of math. What are you talking about? Of course, that's the way to do it. Now, that's a gross generalization, and many math professors, including Einstein and Rich and Feynman and Newton, all said almost exactly the same thing. I have no special capacity other than a dogged determination and fascination. I stick with these problems longer. Whether, then people say, well, what does Einstein know about it himself? Well, like he was a genius. So now you have this thing where you're saying, wait, so you're smarter than Einstein about Einstein. You're saying he's wrong. But this is a common thing, that people who grow and get really good at something, often in some field, are fascinated so that their sense of self, the self-protection, just is not as relevant.
Right.
They're willing to say, I don't get it, because they want to know so badly.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, we don't have time for this, but this whole essentialism and how prominent it is in American society, it really is fascinating. Is it, it's like, is it because we love that genius, we love that, like trope. The ball player who just has this natural ability, they're just, is it like we just don't appreciate the work? I don't know, it's an interesting sociological, historical study that it'd be, there's probably someone who's done it. I just don't know about it. But why are we like that?
And we can hold competing belief systems, right? So there's kind of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Right. But there's clearly a facet in in the American culture, but there's clearly a fascination. So especially in athletics. But then, so I love to puncture that. Who's the greatest hockey player ever? I think he had a name, it was called the greatest. That's Wayne Gretzky. Look at him. Perfectly average athlete. For the NFL, he was low. Who's the GOAT in football? Tom Brady. Famously, like the lowest level of measurables at the combine. Like, okay. I mean, it's not that there aren't fantastic athletes out there who then, also there's a bunch of them who don't perform, but we should at least have some pause here.
Right.
Like, okay, maybe there's some multiple ways to get there. One of which would be to be incredible inherent talent. And you're born with certain qualities, and your muscle beds are longer than other people's, and this allows you to do things. And, but if I am fascinated by this, so I pay attention to it. Michael Jordan was an incredible athlete, friend of yours. I know you invited him to your wedding. But
we're behind that. We're not friends, but
and I've known a few professional athletes, and physically you're like, whoa, you just look like a different creature. Now, on the other hand, they spent years and years doing that. But I've watched like the Big Dance, whatever it's called, the Final Dance, whatever, that documentary on the Bulls and Michael Jordan.
Right.
But everybody says, yeah, incredible athlete, but it's the mental part. It's the drive, right? So that's just a sign. Yeah, even if you have that at that level, you have to perform. But I just see it all over the place, this obvious misattribution of why people achieve. Now, so I think, because I dwell on this, because if I talk about malleability and capacity, the first response to people is, yeah, but I could never play in the NBA. And I'm like, you're right. But the NBA is not even the top 1%. It's the 0.0000001%. Could you become an expert? Could you be in the top 3% of basketball players worldwide if you dedicated yourself to this? Well, the research by Anders Ericsson on expertise, he concludes any sort of fully whole human being can become an expert in anything. Right. So expert means like top 2 or 3% in the world.
Yeah, it just makes me think of Pistol Pete and Larry Bird, who, they always talk about Larry Bird like he couldn't jump. Yeah, he's pretty tall, but it's easy to
not tall in the NBA.
Yeah,
there's a bunch of other 6'9" guys.
Yeah, but you just forget, one, that he just spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours making himself an incredible shooter, and that led to, in part to the confidence that he had. I mean, he was one of the great trash talkers, and he had just this incredible belief in himself. But that was from the practice and whatnot. So yeah.
Well, so.
Well, I'd be curious, just to transition one, unless you have another point.
No, I realized it was a bit of a digression. So yeah, bring us back.
No. I was curious because it seems like so there is this essentialism, like, so I'm this way, and that, but I'd be curious about the externalization, like, because there seems to be this belief that, well, society has to accommodate me in my fixedness. Is that right? I mean, it seems like we're kind of in this age where we have to celebrate everything. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I mean, that was kind of a cryptic way to introduce that subject, but
yeah. Well, let me back up 1 second, then I'll try not to get distracted and come back to it. But so even this idea of fixed beliefs, so many people are aware of Carol Dweck's work and her proteges or many graduate students on this idea of mindset. And so she and her teams did things empirically that demonstrated things that have been observed for many years before that. But one thing that's not often talked about, but her book Mindset, there's a chapter on this, shows that actually having a fixed belief can be helpful. Because you say, I'm a math person, so I have confidence. I come into the math environment, I'm positive, I'm like, I'm going to kill it. And that mental state is useful. And then you do perform well, then you explain it in terms of your ability and your confidence rises. And it strengthens your sense of efficacy and like, I'm good at this, so if I can't figure it out now, I can do it. It can work that way. The thing is, what they show is it works until it doesn't, then it's really bad because you have this fixed belief. So if you have some repeated failures, then you say, oh, my belief was wrong. Rather than, okay, my ability doesn't apply this way. I still hold the idea that it's fixed. Now I just say, I thought I was a math person, but I guess I'm not. Rather than, I was a math person, I was very effective in that environment. I need to figure out how to be effective in this environment. And that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I think just to go back to our PAW formula, when that happens and why it's such a precipitous fall is because it's touching on your self-worth. Like, people don't say, oh, well, I'm not a math person anymore. It's like, it's devastating. It really hits the core of who you are, and you're left in the wilderness of wondering, well, who am I? Do I have a purpose here, or something like that? So it can lead to this kind of existential crisis. So just to
Yeah.
reiterate that
Yeah,
point.
and it does. I know you've seen it. I saw it at Princeton, at Berkeley, where people encounter new expectations, environments, demands, standards that they're not prepared for. That doesn't mean they're not capable. They're not prepared for that, but they explain and they make an attribution of their unmet expectations in terms of their ability. Why? Because that's what people do in our society. It's really common. People do that. That's what Dweck showed. What Covington added to that was not only is it your sense of your ability, it equates to your sense of worth. And that's why it's so painful and also leads people to shut down, right? Because they're feeling shame and they're avoidant. And that's another strata of humanness besides your beliefs about abilities. It's your beliefs in a moral and fundamental dimension. I'm not worthy. And so if you conclude I'm not capable, that's one thing. If you conclude I'm not worthy, I think we can all see that's a different level of pain and therefore an explanation. But to your point, in our moment, in this time, I think in education, that's what I can speak to. I think it's this kind of simplistic thinking. So, for instance, that okay, we want to be inclusive. I want anybody who comes. If Princeton admits somebody to college, we should create conditions where they can be successful. In principle, it's like if we have built-in barriers that they can't overcome, well, we set them up. That's not fair. That's not good for anybody. On the other hand, we sometimes have this idea that the responsibility resides only in the environment. And this goes back to the kind of, I think, similar, simplistic, dualistic thinking, which is if a student, let's say, is dyslexic and they're in college, then we need to make every text available in a way that they don't have to read it. Okay, I think that's a misunderstanding of what dyslexia is. Dyslexia isn't you can't read. Dyslexia isn't you can't make meaning from text. And the world you're going to live in is going to have text in it. So how might we do both? These are not mutually exclusive, right? Okay, so we're going to be more accommodating and we're going to be very intentionally about developing your skills and ability. And guess what? You need to as well, because you're an adult. So you need to take some responsibility to develop your capacities and capabilities in this domain. And we as an institution not only are going to address where you're at because we admitted you, but we're also going to help you develop those things. And I just think all that other stuff never happens. It's what's the accommodation? And I think it's simplistic, it's wrong, it's unhelpful for students. Now, in the higher ed space, we can try to explain why that is. I will, which is, most professors are not trained educators. So they don't really know how to do that. But that doesn't let the institution off the hook, I would say. So I think to the extent that that's a microcosm of what you're talking about, I think it's this simplistic, categorical, mutually exclusive thinking that if somebody's responsible, then the other person isn't. I just don't think that's true. And then for the individual person, you might even, so if my university is doing that, you could say they're systematically handicapping you. They're giving you a crutch. And what you want to do is build your muscles in your leg, not have a crutch. So they could be mistaken. But in the end, again, in college, your education is what you make of it.
Right. Yeah, and that's a hard message because, and it's a
absolutely
tricky message because because in a way you want to say, hey, I wish the world could accommodate you in every dimension of your being, but and it might be working towards that. Like higher ed at least is in some sense trying to do that, but it's for what you need, it might be 20 years down the road that they get to that point. So what can you do now? Because just to say, well, society or my company or my college, university didn't do X, Y, and Z, well, it's all their fault, or it's all it's all their responsibility. They didn't come through, so I'm going to leave, or I'm just whatever. You just cast this judgment on them. That's just a really unhealthy life and for you personally, where you could and what we're trying to say is, yeah, again, on the one hand, we wish society would accommodate you in whatever way, but it's most likely not. So but that creates an opportunity for you to grow, develop yourself. and you shouldn't just chuck that opportunity away. Those tensions create opportunities, and instead of seeing them as barriers or ways that society is judging you, all these ways we can kind of project, like what Kierkegaard would call acoustic illusion. All the problems are outside myself, versus saying, and it's not to say we want to say it's all on you, it's just saying, hey, these are opportunities for you to grow, develop, and through that, grow your self-esteem and self-worth by overcoming these challenges. And so it's just trying to create a different perspective on your current situation that could be healthier for you.
Yeah, that leads to growth and development, and there's lots of examples of these. So a couple, I'm just going to mention a couple that I think we're both appealing and saying, yes, the institution has responsibility. I would say that college and universities have different responsibilities than compulsory K-12 education, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but I do think that those are different. And one of the main reasons is because college students are adults. So, and let's say to the individual, you're an adult. The question is, how do you want to be an adult in the world? And what does school do to you? Are you only going to rely on whatever institutions provide to you? I don't know that the current state of our institutions or organizations are going to provide all your human needs. I think you're going to have to go after that. As one of my mentors in graduate school said, know what you want or take what you're given. So what is it you want out of your education? Go get it. But there's a couple of things that strike me. One is an example, probably the most influential reading I did in graduate school when I was my master's, and I was getting a reading specialist. There's an article, I think it's called Successful Dyslexics. It follows, I recall, 7 people who got PhDs, created companies, who were, had legitimate diagnoses of dyslexia and quite significant and severe. Yet they found their ways through to use their capacities to attain and learn and process. That's a message I would like people to convey. Like, I'm not diminishing the difficulty. I'm not minimizing the fact that our institutions are not designed in many ways for our students. Yes, let's try to improve them. At the same time, that can be a strength, and there is an impulse, there is a kind of current in some of the discourse that, hey, that's actually a strength, or at least it could be a strength, that you process the world in a different way. But almost certainly, you're going to have to, as an individual or as a community or a family, you're going to have take extra initiative to make it a strength, right? Because the system isn't designed for you. And some of that is bias, some of that is blind spots, some of that's just, I think, just practicality. Like, airplane seats have a size. Like, okay, they're not good if you're 4'6" or 7'6". I don't know that there people are going out of their way to sideline those people, but but that's just the reality of living in a massive society. But the main thing is, given that, maybe it's a disadvantage, maybe it's wrong, maybe certainly it can be bad. I think you and I lived in the world and change it. In fact, if you could be successful by showing initiative and being efficacious and building your skills, you might then use that to change the world. I'm all for it. But when I look out at the nature of human existence and societies, that's just not how it happens. Plus, I think I said the last thing, so I'm on a roll here. When you take on that responsibility, then you get a sense of fulfillment because of yourself. You grew and you feel good about it.
Yeah, and I mean, this could be controversial, but why not? You were, before we got going on our discussion, you were talking about ADHD and some of the messaging that is going on right now. Can you talk about that? Because it goes right into this example, or what we're talking about. Really kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a lot of the things we've been talking about. There's sort of the theory, the concept, the principle. Then it's how it's applied,
right?
And applied through the prism of our contemporary American society. Then it's applied through the, we're human frailties of wanting to be protected and safe and have hold ourselves in high regard. And so sometimes these labels or categories, ADHD, as an example, they they lead us to this protective outcome, right? So instead of saying, okay, attention is something that I can direct and control. And in fact, if I examine my behavior, there are times I'm fully immersed in things, and other times I'm not. How can I build on that? What can I do about that? If the institution gives you an accommodation, fantastic, use it. But does that actually help you cultivate and build these capabilities? If ADHD, or that diagnosis explains your behavior in certain ways and it suggests certain kinds of strengths that you can then find creative ways to use it. It's your superpower. Fantastic. That doesn't mean it's your only power, right? That doesn't mean it's the only thing you can do. So I think is this what you're wondering about? Or
no, you were mentioning how people kind of today were saying like ADHD is your superpower. And does that become like another form of essentialism? And it's in the sense that like it could lead to a number of beliefs, or one is, well, if it's my superpower, then everyone should celebrate it, and society needs to accommodate it. Also, it could lead to this idea, well, great, yeah, so then so this is my superpower and this is just the way I am, comes a fixed mindset, versus saying, hey, society is never really going to, most likely not, at least now, or at least for the time being, is not going to celebrate this or accommodate it outside of certain settings like your school, and perhaps your workplace. I'm not sure, but so how do you, with this certain way of being, or certain tendencies in terms of your attention, how do you say, okay, I have work to do here. What can I do to, one, use it constructively and perhaps build skills to help me be more productive, more, make life in society better for me and for others. I think there's, again, it's the work to be done, instead of just saying, well, you're this way, society has to somehow celebrate that. It becomes very protective. I don't have to do any work. It's all the work has to be done outside me by others.
Yeah, I think you said it well, that an essentializing tendency that points to deficit or inadequacy, that's unhelpful in two ways. One is essentializing, and one is it undermines your efficacy and confidence. Going the other direction can also perhaps counterintuitively have a problem, in the sense that it's essentializing you again. So it's a superpower, so I don't need to develop this, or it would be beneficial, or I can't do it, or I don't have to do it. Some of those questions I'll leave for others, but I would say, just to use this example since you raised it, I mean, attention is pretty basic, yet it can be directed and it can be enhanced. We can cultivate that skill. We can design our environments. How we set a purpose in a cognitive, very intentional purpose level can shape our intention, which is sort of purpose and action, which is very much attention. And so if having a label, like being given a diagnosis like that, interrupts that, I would say, adaptive, productive, constructive response, then that essentializing element of labeling has been counterproductive. Even as it helps people understand themselves, perhaps, and understanding is important, I think most people would say, but skillfulness is important too. Capacity is important too. Confidence, efficacy, those are important as well. And I think you and I believe that, number one, it's possible to cultivate those things, and the individual is a crucial unit of analysis too. Right? Like you're with you all the time.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, we need to wrap up, but I really, it's so fascinating. The point you made about how, our society can hold these contradictory beliefs. I think it's so true, because on the one hand, we celebrate the genius, we celebrate these individuals who we think are superhuman. They just have these superpowers. And yet we do, at the same time, kind of celebrate people who,
grind it out.
Yeah, grind it out. But yeah, they're not reconciled, or they're not, it's not like, but it's still the message to get across of like your own individual development in the mundane aspects of life even, that's still a very, very hard message to get across to people, even though we do celebrate these people with grit and, the stick-to-itiveness and perseverance. So interesting. Anyway, so last thoughts, so what? We started off, talking about Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, StrengthsFinders, the colors, what color is your parachute, all these classification tests so just any last thoughts there, or the so what that you would want to convey to folks?
I think I don't know if it's very practical, but so what is, these instruments are tapping into these beliefs that you were just talking about, and we may not even be aware of how beliefs are influencing our actions and choices and decisions, but they are, and that it is practical to examine those beliefs and recognize that you might have beliefs in there that are irreconcilable, create dilemmas. And then practically speaking is to accept that. That's a good place to start. Don't I have this bad belief, I'm bad again, right? So I think, again, often the first starting point in our approach is acceptance of the state of things. With that often comes calm. It's not resignation. And then I can be purposeful in my choices to change.
Yeah, it's interesting, even that judgment of yourself. When you're judgmental, that's kind of a fixed mindset in a way, right? Because you're just saying, well, I'm bad, and instead of saying,
I shouldn't have to do this, I shouldn't do that. Yeah.
Exactly right. Instead of saying, okay, that wasn't great, but how can I improve the next time? And I think that's kind of the attitude we want people to have. And I mean, again, the idea of self-awareness, that you are always, this is my so what, is you're always with yourself, and every experience you have has been formed by your grappling with your self-worth, the drive for purpose and meaning, either trying to achieve that, sustain it, figure it out, whatever. And a lot of what goes on in terms of procrastination or fixed mindsets, and however that manifests itself, imposter syndrome, those are often products of not being self-aware. Because, and so you're prey to these tendencies to self-protect. And so, and so becoming self-aware it's funny, because how do you get someone to become self-aware? Well, you can't. They have to do it themselves. But so I would say, like, in these tough situations where you got to, let's say, you didn't get a grade that you were hoping for, or, something at work didn't work out the way you didn't want to, can you have that detective mentality, like, where you like, well, how am I inclined to react here? How am I looking to protect myself, and whatnot? Do I just even beating myself up is a way of self-protection? It's a way, I mean, it's perverse, but it's a way of, like, if I just beat myself up enough, then I kind of feel okay, I can move on. That's the way I lived my life, was just beating the crap out of myself internally. But it's unhealthy. But if I beat myself enough, like that was kind of penance in a way. People learn a lot about me here.
I was thinking the exact same thing myself. That was the word that came to mind, by the way.
Yeah. So anyway, but it's there's kind of penance, and so if you become a detective, you're kind of like, you start asking yourself, well, why am I doing that? And that to me is such a powerful thing. Like, why am I doing that? Am I content with that? Like, do I really want to live that life? And hopefully you say no. And then, well, how do I start to on a journey to, and it's going to be difficult because you've developed these habits, these ways of being that have created a certain level of comfort. And so to start off and say, no, I'm not going to live that life anymore, is really, really hard. It's very, very difficult. And we acknowledge that, but it's a journey that leads to a better life, I think, and a life that's freer, that's more exciting and fulfilling. So I don't know if that was probably more inspirational, but then so what? But that's where I want people just to say, like, in those moments where you're about to judge yourself, about to beat yourself up, or you've other ways that we self-protect, just ask yourself why and start thinking like, what am I doing here? I guess that's it. Yeah. I know I want to end, Nick,
So that was great. I think
Okay.
you wove in a so what and an inspirational story and it made it concrete. I tend to go toward abstraction. So I think it was a great place to stop.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much, Nick. As always, I learned a ton, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you, Matt. That was great.
All right, take care.